of the World Benchmarking. I'm delighted to be here today for the launch of the World Benchmarking Alliance's first gender benchmark. Sorry, Zoom was just popping up to remind me that this meeting is being recorded. It is. You'll all be able to watch it back later. The benchmark assesses and ranks 35 of the world's most influential apparel companies on their progress towards achieving gender equality and women's empowerment, looking at their entire value chain from boardrooms to factories and across marketplaces. It's a clear-eyed, evidence-based analysis that provides some much-needed transparency and accountability in an industry that often flies under the radar. And it's a really important tool to enable stakeholders to come together and focus on strategic solutions. So today we're going to start with an overview of the report's key findings and takeaways from the World Benchmarking Alliance's gender lead, Shamistha Selvaratnam, followed by a panel discussion highlighting the perspectives of a diverse range of stakeholders and addressing strategic solutions to drive gender equality in the private sector. It's a critical moment to take stock of the situation in an industry that has a huge impact on the lives of women. Fashion has an outsized cultural influence, and women are its biggest target market. At the same time, chronically low wages and consistent labor abuses reported in its supply chain also fall on a predominantly female workforce. Women dominate in low-paid retail roles and are well represented in most levels of the industry, except at the top. In fact, while fashion is leaning into a new wave of feminism in the way it markets to consumers, it is making little progress in driving gender equality within the industry itself, as the gender benchmark found. And the pandemic has exacerbated existing inequalities across all sectors, with its economic fallout disproportionately falling on women. This launch is taking place on the sidelines of the UN Gender Equality Forum, which points to a gender equality crisis that requires urgent action. Companies have a vital role to play, but they are moving far too slowly. The gender benchmark highlights a gap in apparel companies' public commitments and their actions. It shows there is much more work to be done, but there's also an exciting opportunity to drive a race to the top within the private sector to ensure economic justice and rights. So in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Shamistha to take us through the benchmark's finding. But first, although I am sure you are all well versed in digital events by now, and this will go very smoothly, just a little bit of housekeeping. As I said at the beginning, we're recording the session, but it will be available later for you guys to watch on YouTube. And we also want to hear from all of you in the audience. There's going to be time at the end for questions. So please drop those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and join the conversation online using the hashtag #ActForEqual. We're also going to be live tweeting the event using the hashtags GenderBenchmark2021 and launch event. So you can follow along on Twitter and join the conversation there as well, or jump in after the session finishes to continue the conversation online. Okay, that is enough from me. Let's get to the main event. Over to you, Shamistha.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. The World Benchmarking Alliance is delighted to present its 2021 Gender Benchmark, which assesses the actions that the world's 35 most influential apparel companies are taking to address gender inequalities and empower women. The World Benchmarking Alliance is a multi-stakeholder alliance, and our work and vision have always centered on the Sustainable Development Goals. We bring together a diverse set of actors to incentivize the private sector to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and we hold companies to account in how they do so. We do this by measuring the performance of the 2,000 most influential companies globally. These are the companies that can lead and enable systems change around the world. Our social transformation focuses on human rights, decent work, and ethical conduct, and puts people at the center of all transformations, recognizing that the SDGs can only be achieved if no one is left behind. Gender equality is fundamental to the social transformation, as moving the needle in this area has the potential to drive catalytic change in support of the Sustainable Development Goals. The Gender Benchmark takes a deep dive into how companies drive and promote gender equality and women's empowerment across their entire value chain in order to accelerate corporate progress in closing the gender gap. This is a critical step in understanding how to scale up our assessments to drive impact across many more sectors and companies. Very simply put, there can be no sustainable development without gender equality. In reality, however, gender inequalities are pervasive globally. As Sarah mentioned, women are underrepresented in leadership positions. They are paid less than their male colleagues and they participate less in the labour force. They also spend more time on unpaid care and domestic work. They face sexual harassment and gender-based violence and receive limited support for their health needs. And we've seen that these inequalities have only been deepened by the COVID-19 pandemic, widening the gender gap even further. At WBA, we believe that companies are uniquely positioned to drive gender equality and women's empowerment, and our gender benchmark methodology provides the roadmap for companies to do so. Our very first benchmark focuses on the apparel sector because of the high number of women workers involved in its operation and supply chain, as well as the number of consumers the sector reaches. From our research, we have gained numerous insights into the extent to which the apparel sector is driving action to address gender inequalities and empower women. Our insights were complemented by a women worker engagement study conducted by our ally, Good Business Lab, who interviewed women workers in India operating across 12 different factories. We're looking forward to hearing from Ankita from Good Business Lab later. Some very strong messages emerged from our research, which focused on company efforts across their operations, supply chain, marketplace, and community, focusing on various topics, namely governance and strategy, representation, compensation and benefits, health and well-being, and violence and harassment. Overall, we found that while apparel companies may be fast on fashion, they are slow on gender equality, and as a result, they are not on track to contribute meaningfully to the achievement of SDG 5. We found that companies averaged 29 points out of 100. Only Adidas, Gap, and VF Corporation, who we'll hear from later in the event, scored above 50 points. Diving a bit deeper into our findings, we found that firstly, companies lack the ambition to drive transformative change. Transformative change is vital to the achievement of SDG 5 and beyond. That is change that has positive impacts on women. As shown on the slide, almost half the companies assessed scored between 0 and 30%, with a similar number of companies scoring between 30 and 50%. Only 3 companies scored between 50 and 60%. With the World Economic Forum recently reporting that closing the global gender gap has increased by a generation in the past year from 99.5 years to 135.6 years, we really need to see companies demonstrating real ambition and commitment to have any hope of achieving gender equality and supporting SDG 5. Secondly, we found that companies need to do more to support women workers in their supply chain and must stop ignoring their employees' needs. We found that company efforts to drive gender equality vary significantly depending on what part of the value chain we look at, as the average scores per value chain element show on the slide. Average scores for the community element are almost double those for supply chain, workplace, and marketplace, with over 80% of companies being seen to support gender equality and women's empowerment initiatives in the community, and a pleasing half of companies participating tracking women and girl beneficiaries across multiple regions. The marketplace is almost the worst performing area. Only half of companies were seen to be promoting positive images of women and girls, with only 2 companies making a public commitment to address how gender stereotypes are portrayed in their marketing campaigns. It's likely to come as no surprise, considering the well-reported negative impacts on women workers in the apparel supply chains, both during the pandemic and before the pandemic, that companies are not doing enough to drive gender equality in the supply chain. While many companies have mechanisms in place to identify and assess actual or potential adverse impacts that are gender-related in their supply chain, these mechanisms really need to be improved in order to better detect gender-related issues in the supply chain. What we also see is that appropriate training and support for suppliers is currently scarce, particularly in relation to the topics of non-discrimination, health and well-being, and violence and harassment. What is perhaps most surprising is that the average score in the workplace is, at 26%, the lowest across all value chain elements. For example, while a slim majority of companies engage with external stakeholders to inform their gender efforts, only 1/5 of these companies engage their own employees, specifically on gender equality issues through surveys or other engagement mechanisms. Further, while 8 companies provide evidence of integrating external stakeholder feedback into company policies and practices, only 1 company displays evidence of integrating its own employees' feedback into company policies and practices. What is really clear from our findings is that companies are focusing more on their external efforts, the women external to their organization, than internal efforts. What we really need to see companies doing is taking an integrated and holistic approach across their entire value chain that considers the different dimensions impacting gender equality. It's only then that companies can truly drive transformative and sustainable change. Thirdly, we found that companies are not ensuring women are prepared for another pandemic. The past 18 months have made it abundantly clear that the world is unpredictable, and companies need their workforce to withstand unexpected shocks in order to survive. It's really critical that companies have policies and practices in place that enable women employees and supply chain workers to thrive in normal times and also endure the turbulent ones. But many of the companies assessed have not done so. For example, childcare and other family support, such as paid time off to attend healthcare appointments with children or dependents, have become increasingly important for employees juggling multiple responsibilities or trying to maintain a work-life balance. However, only half the companies assessed offer childcare support to their employees. Even fewer offer other family support, with 10 companies offering both, as shown on the slide. When we look to the supply chain, only 1 company requires its suppliers to provide childcare support to their workers. Focusing now on flexible working, as shown on the slide, less than half of the companies assessed offer flexible work hours and or locations. Only 1 company tracks employee uptake of its flexible working options. It's really critical that companies seize the moment so that they are better placed to support their women employees and supply chain workers and drive sustainable business performance. Finally, a key focus for us at the World Benchmarking Alliance has been to make the women who are invisible in corporate value chains visible. But what we have learned is that data about these women still remains invisible. Last year, we published our gender baseline report, and we found that very little information was disclosed with regard to what stakeholders expect to see around gender equality. Nearly a year later, we find that there are still massive data gaps. No company discloses more than 55% of the information that stakeholders expect to see, with this lack of data driving poor scores across the benchmarked companies. There is a lack of gender disaggregated data disclosed by companies, and this holds true across a number of metrics. For example, as you can see on the slide, only 2 companies disclose the difference between women's and men's earnings across their operations globally. And no company collects gender data on the remediation of violence and harassment grievances or requires their suppliers to collect this data. If we are to adequately address the needs of 50% of the population, companies need to be much more explicit about how women are impacted by their actions and what they're doing to address those impacts. Now, while numbers alone won't solve gender inequalities, data is necessary to shine a light on problems so that solutions can be identified. It will enable companies to revisit and revise old strategies and make better decisions that lead to better outcomes. We call on all benchmark companies to use our benchmark results to understand where there are gaps in policies, practices, and disclosures, and take steps to address those gaps. We encourage you, as well as other companies who operate within the apparel sector or beyond the apparel sector, to learn from those displaying leading practices in driving transformative change, and to really use this benchmark to guide your efforts to meet global expectations related to gender equality. And to all other stakeholders, Whether you're an investor, policymaker, civil society organization, or consumer, we call on you to play your role in incentivizing the private sector to drive gender equality and women's empowerment, be that through investing with a gender lens, introducing regulatory measures, or using our data and findings to hold companies accountable. Action by each and every one of us is critical in order to make the invisible visible. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamisa, for that overview of both where the industry is at and where there's more work to do. I'm really pleased now to introduce an amazing group of panelists to discuss the topic in more detail and really dive into how we can tackle these issues. So I'm joined virtually, of course, by a wonderful variety of diverse stakeholders. I have Christopher Kipp from UNICEF, who is the organization's global child rights and business specialist and our only male participant. Ankita Nanda, who is the head of partnerships and a design associate at Good Business Lab. Julie Sutton, senior director of government affairs and global impact at VF Corp. Marta Borhaug, Aviva Investors global head of sustainable outcomes and the co-chair of the 30% Club Investor Group, and Paulina Murphy, who is engagement director at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there will be time for questions at the end of this, so please drop those in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So I wanted to kick off, Ankita, but by coming to you. Shamisa obviously mentioned that the Good Business Lab had conducted a study as part of the gender benchmark, and you went and spoke to women workers at 12 factories across India. And I wondered if you could give us a little bit more detail about what you found and what the specific issues facing women in the apparel supply chain are, and where you see the biggest pain points at the moment.
Hey, thank you for the question, Sarah. So we started this conversation with WBA last year, and the problem brief that they gave us was fairly simple. They wanted us to capture the experiences and expectations and aspirations of women workers in the apparel industry. And GBL has been working in the garment industry in India for the last couple of years. So, but we wanted to do something really different with this scope of study. I think at the onset, we wanted to make sure that our data would be representative of different worker personas. So we had access to women workers who worked at large production houses or manufacturing industries, which are typically represented with workers of around 100,000 workers, part of one organization, but also go down to smaller production units, which are typically labeled as informal workers. Before we started the interview exercise, we really didn't map out the different types of workers, within our accessibility. And some of the pain points that I'm going to be elaborating on were recurring themes in all these conversations. But I think one sort of finding that was really, I guess, like a little upsetting to see was that informal workers actually had a lot more difficulty in navigating these pain points because they typically do lack a lot of institutional support from their employers. So I think at the onset, one of the more recurring problems that is backed by some of the other projects that we've done is the lack of access and use of grievance redressal mechanisms available in the factories. So in our conversations, it was pretty evident that the fear of repercussions, in filing a complaint, and also the power hierarchy between, say, a supervisor, typically a male supervisor, and a women worker, acts as an impediment in workers being able to use grievance redressal mechanisms such as HR committees, welfare officers at the factory floor, or even suggestion boxes. Our sort of research has shown that lack of anonymity and also transparency and accountability coming back to the worker in how these grievances are resolved does make the dialogue between a worker and the management very impeded by different reasons. So that, I think, has been a pretty recurring problem, and it's something that the employers should work towards resolving. And I'm happy to elaborate on some of the ideas that we've come up with later on during the panel. I think the two. Sorry.
No, sorry, go on, Ankita. Continue, sorry.
The other 2 points that are sort of interconnected are the lack of roadmap available to women in terms of their career progression. So in our conversations, it was pretty evident that when women join the workforce and in different roles, which is typically, as a fresher or a helper to a tailor, it was mandatory for them to undergo certain skill training. These trainings weren't really formalized, but that kind of expectation was really there. But if you interview women who've been working for 5 to 6 years, it was pretty evident that they actually did not know how to really progress through the ranks. They did not have knowledge or even the access to such kind of opportunities. So that was, again, something that really adds to this phenomena where you do have a predominant women workforce, but very few rising through the ranks and being able to maybe get better opportunities for themselves. The third being the challenges that the few women supervisors that we spoke to and how that really plays into the kind of stereotypes, women in, I would say, any workplace have to really face. Women supervisors were typically not seen as aggressive or as competent as their male counterparts. That was, a predominant feeling that a lot of women workers did speak about. But the second sort of apprehension came from the women workers themselves. So when we asked them about their aspirations or the kind of role models they have, they did speak about how taking on a role with more responsibility would mean increased working hours. And something that is very evident through like various forms of research is that for a woman worker, her work does not stop when she leaves the factory, right? She comes home and she has chores to do. So a lot of women did speak about how they would, even if given the opportunity, have to think about whether they could take on the responsibility if they did not have support systems, like a supportive family or institutional support like transport facilities between the workplace. So I think these were, some quick pain points that have been very recurring, but I just wanted to touch upon the impact of COVID-19 and its impact on women workers. And I specifically want to speak about how informal women workers have really been left behind. Because when we interviewed formal workers, they had access to social security benefits such as, say, health insurance or some sort of financial assistance. And especially in 2020, when there were immense lockdowns, which meant businesses had to be shut down, they had some sort of way in reaching out to their employers and knowing that their jobs were still safe. That was not the case for informal women workers. And in a country like India, where the female labor participation rate is dismally low, I think in the beginning of 2020, it was about 11%. The pandemic in some ways has exacerbated how women are leaving the workforce because there isn't enough institutional support to keep them in.
And Ankita, could you just contextualize very briefly within the apparel industry, how large the informal workforce is? How significant is this within the apparel industry?
So I don't have the exact data, but from I can't say exactly for the apparel industry, but about 80% of India's workforce is informal. So I think that gives you a very good picture of how even within the supply chain, businesses are typically having transactions with exporters and manufacturers who would typically be classified as formal workers, but you have smaller production units that are really feeding into the entire supply chain, and these are the workers who are not as protected.
Yeah, and this is a recurring industry within the issue within the apparel industry, where frequently companies don't know their full supply chain, so it's hard to understand exactly what's happening. And I think that's a good moment to bring in Julie here as sort of our apparel industry representative here. VF did very well within the World Benchmarking Alliance's gender benchmark. But I'm curious to hear from you how you are approaching some of the challenges that Ankita outlined within your supply chain, particularly given that these are not your manufacturers are clients; they're not people that you have direct control over.
Yeah, no, thank you. And first, thanks for having me today. I'm very grateful to the World Benchmarking Alliance for driving improvements on human rights in general, on gender issues, and then on making progress on the SDGs. If it's okay for those of you who are not aware, VF is the parent company of over a dozen apparel and footwear brands, including the North Face, Timberlands, Vans, Dickies, and several others. So again, thank you to the World Benchmarking Alliance for letting us be here today. I think one of the ways that VF tries to address the issues that were brought up is through our traceability program. We've invested a lot into our traceability program so that we understand exactly what's going on, not just at our contract manufacturers, the ones that are actually cutting and sewing our goods, but we nominate our tier 2s, so we know where our fabric is coming from too, and we can use that leverage. We can cascade our policies down to the tier 2s, and then in many cases we know where the cotton is coming from, what plantation the rubber is coming from, where our leather is from, and so that gives us confidence in our ability to make systemic changes where necessary, address some of our salient human rights that have been found through our human rights due diligence, and then also to make sure that our, what we call our compliance principles are not stopping at our contract factories, but are disseminated through our value chain. So I think that's one of the ways that we are trying to address some of the issues that you were just speaking of.
And I think important also to stress how unusual it is in the apparel industry to have that level of transparency. It is not normal at all, and is frequently a stumbling block. I think, Chris, are you still there? Or we may have, oh yes, okay, wonderful. I wondered if I could bring you in here to just build a little bit on what Ankita mentioned on the impact of the pandemic on sort of the issues facing women. How are you seeing that play out, and how much more work do we have to do now as a result of what's happened in the last year?
Sure. Thank you, Sarah, and also from my side, thanks for inviting me here to be part of this. Really congratulations to WBA for this really important and leading work to drive gender equality in a sector that impacts so many, tens of millions of women, not just women, but also parents, fathers as well, families across the world. And so really a big topic also for UNICEF. In a way, we've been working with the industry for several years. And I think the results to us, they don't come as a surprise. They still really show that tremendous gap in holistic measures to promote gender equality, is really as Shamista outlined very, very well. So just to say congrats again, and hopefully this will present a bit of a call to action also for participants, and we here at UNICEF are happy to and looking forward to support this process. So on the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, absolutely. It definitely has brought a lot of awareness to the importance of companies supporting their workers with family-friendly workplaces in particular. So when we speak about family-friendly workplaces, we're talking about paid parental leave, so maternity, paternity, parental leave, access to quality, affordable childcare support, nutrition and breastfeeding support in the workplace, but also issues like living wages that really enable workers, women, parents to earn enough to support their families. And I think those linkages, the broad linkages between family-friendly policies and the impact on women, they have existed before, of course, but the pandemic has really showed how important these measures are, particularly in times of a crisis. Of course, also beyond, but I think we've seen how those gaps, when they don't exist, these support measures, how they impact women in particular, how they impact parents, and the disastrous impact it can have on families. So in a way, the disproportionate burden of care, that's a long-standing issue, a disproportionate care burden that women shoulder, and the COVID-19 crisis has exacerbated that in a way, and has brought this really to the attention. So I think we heard a little bit already from Ankita how perhaps in contrast to previous crises, the COVID-19 crisis has really had a particular impact on industries that have high proportions of female employment. So globally, I think some figures are around more than 500 million, or 40% of all employed women really work in sectors that were really hard hit by COVID-19, and specifically also here looking at the socioeconomic fallout. So, I think some of you might be familiar with the situation in Bangladesh, where it's largely a workforce dominated by women. Women are really driving this sector. They're not represented at the top, but they are represented in terms of the workforce. They make perhaps 60% of workers or more. But the employment of women in that sector really fell by close to 20%, really in the first year of the pandemic, because of the absence of robust social protection systems. And really that could have sort of mitigated those impacts to a certain extent. We know that the not just looking at the apparel and footwear sector, but also the industry, the impact on women more broadly, much more women ended up in poverty. The economic impact much more pronounced. So really, again, I think that impact is particularly pronounced, but we do see businesses also understanding more and more, and I think this is also reflected in the some of the benchmark results, that there's a real need and an opportunity to expand family-friendly policies, to expand care and flexible work for working parents, to also prepare in a way perhaps for the next crisis. I mean, this likely will not be the last, and you know, so that we're better prepared to mitigate those terrible socioeconomic impacts. So I think what we are looking at now is that crucial gap where how do we use the opportunity in a way and create meaningful change, so that some of these provisions that have been implemented by either governments or businesses, that they're made available permanently, and that they're also made available to more workers. Perhaps later in the discussion, we can talk a little bit about what can that look like what can businesses actually do to build on the learnings from the pandemic and really implement stronger measures, often jointly with governments. You know, of course, governments play a critical role in this as well. I mean, we've done an analysis quite recently looking at UNICEF how, you know, the state of childcare in high-income countries, for example, that about only 2% of COVID-19 recovery measures that they were actually earmarked for child-specific social programs, which even less going to childcare support. So it's really a policy choice also among governments, and governments often fail to make the right investment in gender equality and family-friendly policies measures to support that. So while governments must scale up those social protection measures, cash transfers, and sort of integrate gender into those measures, businesses must play their role as well to support that in a way and do what they can. And they have a huge influence here, of course, through their own policies, their own operations, and their own supply chain. So happy to speak a little bit more later, maybe about how those measures could look like in more concrete terms.
I think it's really good you mentioned the importance of highlighting the role of, you know, all of the different stakeholders here. And I wanted to bring in Marta as sort of the investor representative, because I think there's sort of some interesting tensions that were sort of raised by what Chris said. You know, there has been a huge increase in ESG focused investment over the last several years, and there's certainly a lot greater understanding of the value that can be generated long-term in investing in your workforce and more responsible business practices. I lose my headpiece. But you know, as an investor, several of the things that Chris and others here have mentioned require spending money. Living wages means higher cost of manufacturing. Investing in greater benefits for your workforce also means higher costs. What is the balance here from an investor standpoint, and what can investors do to drive positive change?
Yeah, the sort of tightrope there is tricky. I might start with saying that a sort of overarching statement when I read the results of today's benchmark is that I'm getting a bit worried that there's a risk of a sort of gender diversity complacency happening, because I mean, I work as an investor. We talk a lot to companies about all ESG issues. And I think a lot of companies, particularly a lot of company leadership, may have sort of felt that gender was the sort of the last big topic, and now we're moving on to climate. We're within the social space, we're moving on to ethnicity and other issues. But actually what these results show is that we can't take some of the gender progress for granted, and even more importantly, we've got to really step up. So I think you know, I'm quite nervous from seeing the results, and I think we need to avoid that sort of gender complacency and really try and find a way to inspire companies to kind of double down again on gender and really explore how they can take action. So I just wanted to say that as an introductory remark, because I think we can get lost in just talking generalization, but the results are pretty alarming. I think then in terms of what do we need as investors to take action, and what can we do? I think we need better data, and we need better dialogue. I'll sort of try and illustrate what that means in practice a little bit. So better data for me and for us as investors is we need companies to disclose and be more open and transparent about what they're actually doing and the outcomes of it. So currently, I think what the research of the WBA has shown as well is there isn't a lot of actual transparency happening, not enough in the right areas. And I think also, for in my view, we're not seeing a lot of forward-looking measures, properly, not just reporting on what you have done, but your intentions, your targets, and the outcomes of what you've delivered. And I might want to sort of emphasize as well that, Julie mentioned, companies can do a lot themselves, but also increasingly investors are going to be looking elsewhere for data. We will be looking at rankings like the WBA to get that independent view. We will be looking at startups, for example, that can provide us data like Diversio, which is a really cool startup that provides forward-looking information, drawing on social media, Glassdoor, what employees are actually saying about the companies in which they work. So that whole picture will help us make better decisions, but we definitely need companies to be better at giving us more high quality data. Then on the back of that, we can take action as investors. But I would say what we need to move from and to is a focus on individual action towards multi-stakeholder dialogue. And I'll just explain a bit more what I mean by that is there is already a lot of great investor action around diversity. So the 30% Club that I co-chair is one of those examples where we've been engaging with companies for a long time in the UK and now increasingly around the world, individually with companies to try and improve gender diversity at the board, gender diversity in the exec, gender diversity across the operations. However, I feel sometimes that we as investors, we sit in a silo and we make those decisions. We will, exclude companies or include companies or engage with them based on what we think is important as investors. What Ankita has really shown is the value of listening to other stakeholders and actually working more in partnerships. And so one of the exciting things I'm excited about to sort of, to avoid getting into the gender diversity complacency is how can we create spaces for investors to work with civil society organizations, with the employees on the ground to really create and drive that change with the companies. So it's less the sort of individual silos working with their own agendas, but actually we're coming together to really create that sort of rise to the top. And I think the WBA and organizations like the WBA can really help us do that. It creates an amazing meeting place for us as investors to actually hear from people straight on the ground, to hear from civil society, to hear from governments and organizations like Christopher's, to really take action together. Because that, at the end of the day, what that means for people like Julie is they don't hear multiple voices asking them to do different things. It's actually a united effort. And I think that's what we really need to take action. So finishing off with a little bit of a warning, let's avoid the gender complacency or the risk of it and really try and work together to have a better dialogue for the future.
And I think the point you made about the importance of data and transparency is kind of crucial. And Julie kind of alluded to it earlier as well. Paulina, I wanted to bring you in here, obviously representative of the WBA here. You've done benchmarks across several of the different SDGs already. How are you seeing these exercises have an impact? Are they driving change?
Thank you, and thanks to all our participants today. I'm obviously going to say yes, they are driving change, but it's a patient process as well, and it is about that multi-stakeholder dialogue and understanding where the greatest transformational change needs to be and the greatest impact that we need to drive. And I wanted to actually, I share Marta's nervousness and just listening again to Mr. going through our research, we can't be complacent and we still have such a long way to go. And I can talk later about another example from another benchmark, but I do think for this discussion, it's important to highlight really the role of stakeholders in driving forward gender efforts, and because we can't be complacent. So on the one hand, we've heard that more than half of the apparel companies in our benchmark are engaging with external stakeholders, and this is a great sign. And companies are talking and taking into account the views of these different stakeholder groups. But then, on the other hand, these external conversations or the commitments are not yet trickling down into action. So only 7 are in our benchmark are actively speaking to or training employees specifically on gender equality and women's empowerment issues. So this is the beauty, I think, or the action that we want to see from the different stakeholder groups in how they can support companies. So we all have a common goal in SDG 5, and now we have our benchmark, which sets out the transformational change we need to commit to and achieve. This helps us to have a common understanding of companies' potential impact and how to get to SDG 5 aligned transformation. And this speaks really to Marta's point about us not working in silos. So if we have a unified map and a way to get there, that helps us all understand companies with their ambition. We know that we heard from our benchmark results that companies are lacking in ambition to drive transformative change. So we hope that our benchmark can support companies moving from the firefighting that they've been forced to do, particularly in the face of the crisis, to actually thinking more of the transformation that they need to get to. And we, in coming together in this multi-stakeholder way, should also know that we can't expect companies to do this on their own. And we need to come in and support so that they can actually move from firefighting to action and taking that forward. And a part of that coming together is that we should also feel that responsibility. We all wear clothes. So what are you doing to understand where you buy from and where your investments are going? So we hope that our benchmark can drive that impact too. So for all of us to understand the choices that we're making and how we empower ourselves, but how we really critically need to empower the female workers who are making the clothes that we're all talking about today. So I'll stop there for now, but there is the clarity, I think, in terms of what does our benchmark bring to the table, it's that clarity to the different stakeholder groups, which then get taken forward through the different actions, whether it's Marta as an investor and having a dialogue with what the company is doing in her daily engagements.
And I think having that level of both scrutiny and accountability is really important, because this is a really complex issue and it covers a lot of different things. And I think also to Marta's point about us almost beginning to forget about gender issues, it actually cuts across many of the different elements of the SDGs. So it's really crucial that it remains in focus. I just want to remind everyone watching to not forget to drop questions in the Q&A box. I'm going to ask a few more questions, but then I'll turn it over to the audience. One thing I did want to do is, Julie, come back to you and ask you, off the back of this conversation we've been having, where do you see the biggest focus areas for BF going forward, and for the industry, indeed, to address the issues of gender inequality?
Yeah, thanks. I was going off mute to make a comment anyway. I just wanted to kind of second what Paulina said. I think that this is already making an impact. I know at BF, we have a pretty aggressive gender strategy, but once we got our final Excel spreadsheet, we poured over all of, what we'll call wins, but then also the opportunities. And we've already met with our, inclusion and diversity officers. We're already trying to, see where we can make progress. I would say, candidly, one of the areas where we can make progress is on the sex disaggregated data. So we collect a lot of that. We know how many women are leaving, and we know, potential pay gaps, and we know grievance data, but we're not reporting those and recognizing quite clearly, especially, and Marta said the same thing, disclosing that data and the outcomes is going to be an important thing for us to focus on going forward. And then I think, and this is mentioned a couple different times, so one of the issues that we're focused on, but surely not one that we can solve alone, is addressing gender-based violence, right? So we have 1 million people in our contract factories, 80% of them are women. You know, we know the stats from the World Health Organization that 1/3 to 2/3 of them have been, you know, victims of sexual violence. So we're really looking at this from a holistic point of view. You know, we've got our a policy that's to eradicate gender-based violence and harassment. It has new requirements for suppliers. Some of it is training, some of it is strengthening the grievance mechanisms. Some of it is policy strengthening in the countries where we operate. And then of course there's a corporate perspective to that too, and there's training. So that's something we're focusing on. I think that, you know, all in all, we're doing a lot, but this conversation shows that, you know, a lot of the inequalities that women are facing are systemic. And while we can use our influence with our own associates, the 40,000 of them, and our millions of factory workers, you know, we need to partner, like has been mentioned, with civil society and with governments and with NGOs and with, you know, the World Benchmarking Alliance in this case to make that transformative change that we're talking about. And Sarah, you said at the beginning that, you know, this is a great opportunity in front of us, and I recognize that. And just, yeah, I think that there's a lot of work to do, and I know lots of companies are doing really good things, but like Marta said, it's time to accelerate that so that we can meet the ambitions of SDG 5.
And I'm curious, Ankita and Chris, off the back of that, and maybe Ankita, I'll address this to you first. You know, have you seen any examples of really effective stakeholder engagements where these kind of actions have really had an impact on the lives of women in the supply chain?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I would like to talk about one specific example that touches on, you know, the grievance redressal mechanisms that do exist. And Julie did mention how sexual violence and harassment has been a recurring theme, and in our research about the effectiveness of grievance redressals in resolving situations where women workers do not feel comfortable enough in stepping forward and even like placing complaints, even if committees and proper you know, mechanisms exist in addressing such issues, has kind of like facilitated to think about ways in which we can solve the issue of just facilitating dialogue between workers and management, be it day-to-day issues of like not knowing when their pay is coming, or issues where you know, they know that they want to file a complaint against like maybe another peer or a supervisor. So we basically did a lot of field work, and we spoke with a lot of workers to really map out their experiences in using you know, traditional forms of grievances mechanisms such as suggestion boxes. And when we were able to really map out the pain points, we realized that if we could come up with a solution that prioritized anonymity, we could maybe lead to workers trusting these grievance redressal mechanisms a little bit more. So we used various design thinking methodologies to create a worker voice technology tool called Inachi. And just to give some statistics to really prove how the evidence has supported how such innovative solutions can help a situation. Between November 2019 and May 2021, we looked at the utilization rate of this technology tool vis-a-vis suggestion boxes. And we found that across several factories where this tool was implemented, about, if I'm looking at the statistics correctly, 74,000 workers you know, filed around 3,000 complaints using this tech tool. The utilization rate was about 4.5%. And if we looked at how suggestion boxes were used, it was about 0.6%. So there was already this churn happening where workers did see that, you know, the comfort in anonymity made them reach out to their management a little bit more. Grievances were being solved faster because you had a much more prepared system where HR was incentivized to, you know, resolve these grievances and report back to the worker with any possible solution. So this is one maybe example in ways in which if you engage with key stakeholders, which in this case are the workers themselves, and with the factory management, HR, who all need to be on board if you're coming up with a solution that has not existed in the factory, it could lead to like positive changes. Yeah.
Christopher, I see you nodding there. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an extremely important point that, you know, around, it's not just about action and taking measures, but really also taking the right and holistic measures. And I think that aspect that Ankita mentioned around worker-centric approaches, which are really predicated on consultation, on meaningful processes, on needs assessments, on an analysis of what women or workers, parents need, I think that's really critical. And, you know, it sounds a bit obvious, but the reality is, I mean, we've done a little bit of our own analysis and some work with the industry, and we had a big collaboration with NBIM, the large Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. And when you look at company practices, there is a lot happening sometimes, but it's really often a bit of a tick boxing exercise. And, you know, policies are in place, but it's often, or not often, sometimes more to protect the company than to actually show that meaningful change or transformative change can be achieved. So I think that worker-centric approach is particularly important here when it comes to, of course, gender equality, but also family-friendly policies more broadly. And there's, I think, aspects that link to that. So that measures are actually gender sensitive and gender transformative, because we do see measures that there's actually a risk that they might reinforce gender stereotypes, or they might reinforce an unequal distribution of care. So of course it's important to strengthen maternity leave, for example, but there should also be measures around incentivizing fathers to take leave, paternity leave, equal share of parental leave. So to create that culture that it's not a woman's responsibility to only look after children, but it is really something where you know, companies can play a leading role in shifting that discourse towards a much more equal distribution of care. And linked to that also inclusive measures, so that measures are accessible. I think Akita said that earlier, to temporary workers or to informal workers, but also from a viewpoint of disability or race, to make sure that policies don't just exist and companies say we have policies, but are they actually meeting the needs of workers and particularly women. I mean, we often cite this example of childcare, which, you know, many companies now do have something around childcare in their policies or in their supply chain requirements for suppliers. But all of us who've been to a childcare facility, you know, it's not the matter of does the childcare exist. The question is, does it meet the needs of the working population? And unfortunately, often the answer, does the childcare exist? If we're talking about a formal daycare facility in the factory, the answer is yes, it's a legal requirement in many countries. But if you ask the question, if you ask women workers or parents, does it actually meet your needs? Most of the time, the answer will be no. So really important to have that emphasis on what is actually the need of the workers. How can we address that? And I think the other thing I wanted to say quickly that links to that is what's the impact of those measures and the policies actually on workers, on women and families. So tracking progress, measuring impact, really continuously monitoring also the implementation and outcomes for people. So I think Marta spoke to that. There's a huge paucity of data and lack of information about the impact that those policies actually have. So this is sort of the next generation, I think, going forward, not just on gender equality, but also more broadly on human rights. Like what impact do those policies have, and how can companies set a better system to really monitor and track that? And then lastly, perhaps that came up really strongly also from Shamista, I think, which is important to us, that we do see action that's sort of almost in parallel to a business's core operations, like very important programs to support women or families or children in the communities. But this really needs to be also integrated into the core of the core business operations and the supply chains, and really looking at how do companies' own purchasing practices and their supplier relationships, their contracts, their capacity building, how do those impact on women, and not just a parallel standalone program that talks about women empowerment, whereas the whole core of the company, the operations it has, how it affects the suppliers, enables the employers to really support workers. That needs to be part of that discussion. I think we have a bit of a gap here still between sort of corporate action on some of those more charity philanthropical area of work and really the core impact that businesses have on the supply chain.
Yeah, and I think that also identifies the gap between, you know, how useful these, you know, tools like the benchmark are to provide information about where we're at, but it's not the solution in itself. We have to keep pushing. I am gonna open this up a little bit to questions from the audience now, and I'm gonna bring Shamista back in because the first question is for her, which is how can you explain that the scores in the benchmark are so low?
Sure, I think this is a really interesting question. I think what we have seen, and the reason I think that we're seeing that companies are scoring so low, is that we are seeing that companies aren't taking this strategic approach to gender equality and women's empowerment, that being an approach that looks across the entire value chain and at all the different dimensions impacting gender equality. So we've found that less than half of the companies are taking action across all the value chain elements, and an even smaller number of companies are taking action across the different topics that I mentioned earlier, including violence and harassment, health and well-being, representation. And so I think what we need to see is that companies take such an approach and really lead the way across all the areas that our methodology assesses, rather than following. And I think that's the only way that we can start to see meaningful change and meaningful change and meaningful progress towards the achievement of SDG 5.
And yeah, I mean, it's an incredible piece of work you've done and looked at things in a lot of detail. And so, I highly recommend everyone go and look at it in more detail themselves. Next question is from Chris Brown, and it's for you, Martha. He's interested to hear more about how the investor community can incorporate gender considerations into decision making and potential ideas for how to incorporate a benchmark like this into investment choices.
Yeah, so I mean, as a positive high level note, I think it's really great to see that sustainable investing is sort of becoming a lot more mainstream. It's something that I couldn't have dreamt of when I walked into this industry when it was still a very small niche. But last year, at least in the UK, half of all new money that went into funds with a sustainability objective or an ESG objective. It's generally that's quite a revolution that's starting to happen across the investment space. In terms of how you can embed data like this, I think there's generally three main things we can do. One is to think about what we don't want to own. It's a bit negative, but if a company, there's already either products out there or just companies that tend to, or investment firms that tend to not want to invest in a company if they've scored very poorly on human rights or specifically on gender, and you can use various types of data to underpin that. So there is definitely something about what do you not want to own. Then there's something which for me is so much more important, which is what do you want to own? What are you including? So identifying, even though they may not be on this benchmark leaders yet, but they're at least leading the way in trying to improve. So making sure that we can allocate capital and identify the companies that are at least scoring highly on these rankings and trying to allocate capital to them. And I think that's something that is increasingly becoming more important for investors. It's not just what do I want to not invest in, it's actually which companies am I interested in supporting so that I can back their journey. And then finally, I think you would want strategies not just to think about where to put your dollar or your pound, but actually once you own these companies, how are you leaning in and engaging with them and voting, using your vote to really try and change behaviors with those companies, because there is no such thing as a perfect sustainable company. I think we could all probably admit that even if you look at the insurance and investment sector, we're really lagging behind on gender diversity as well. And so there is no such thing as perfection. So actually what's more important is transformation. It's having good dialogues with companies and saying, we're not going to necessarily punish you immediately for reporting a bad stat. I mean, Julie was flagging that it can be a bit sort of nerve-wracking to be reporting some of these stats because you can get lots of media attention or bad investor reactions, but actually creating a better space for dialogue and then really being able to say to the companies, here's the 2-3 areas we want you to focus on over the next year or two. And if the companies then don't change, you need to have there needs to be a carrot and a stick. So there needs to be some kind of threat that you will maybe pull away your capital at the end of the day. So there's lots of different ways you can embed benchmarks like this. We at Aviva Investors, for example, already use the ranking of the CHRB, which is the human rights benchmark. Already we embed that into how we vote against companies at their annual general meetings, and we're engaging with them as well in bilateral meetings to try and encourage them to change. And the good news is we're hearing a lot of the same kind of feedback that Julie has been saying, which is, isn't it, we can use this benchmark to guide us for how we're going to get better. And so at the end of the day, benchmarks like this can really help give us a pathway for change. So I think that's can definitely take action. And you should all, as Paulina said, think about where your money is invested, whether it's a pension or a savings account. It's probably not going where you think it's going.
I'm going to follow up and ask if we need to have a disclosure framework for things like gender diversity and inclusion, similar to what we're seeing with climate. And how far off are we developing something like that?
I would say yes, we do need that. I mean, Shamista might have some other thoughts, but I think getting more harmonized and like clarity on which data companies should be reporting will be really essential. But what I would say, and I've said the same on climate, for me, you can't disclose your way to deliver the Paris Agreement or to deliver gender outcomes. Disclosure is only a reflection of what you're currently doing. So I would say to any CEO or chair out there, don't wait for the perfect measure or the metric to be agreed. We all know what the good looks like. I mean, Christopher was mentioning, parental leave for men and women is a huge step forward for gender equality. Treating workers and listening to workers and having a worker-centric approach is another. This isn't necessarily rocket science. So I'd say let's not wait for the perfect disclosure regime, although I'm sure that a lot of companies would welcome one.
Yep, I think that's a very good point. I'm going to ask one more question and then we're at time. And this is really a follow-up to the point Ankita made about, how anonymous reporting can really help. And Julie, I wondered, and this is from an anonymous questioner, but are there practical ways in which companies can bring supply chain workers into the process of pushing for change? And how are you guys addressing that at VF?
Sure. And Chris mentioned this too. One of the things that we do is we conduct a biannual needs assessment to really understand what the workers are facing in our factories. So we roll it out across a couple dozen countries, a couple thousand workers. And the needs assessment speaks to, things like, what are you doing? How many kids do you have? What sort of childcare facilities do your kids go to? How long do you commute to work? What do you normally eat for breakfast? I mean, it's very broad. It's a couple hundred questions, but it allows us to understand what are some of the gaps and needs at the factories. Like Chris mentioned, in Bangladesh, many of them are proper daycares and child-friendly business practices in the factories. And to address that gap, we work with UNICEF on a program on child-friendly business practices. But in other countries like Cambodia, there's gaps in health and nutrition, for example, or access to menstrual products. So this needs assessment really allows us to understand what the workers are facing in the factories. And it gets broader, it gets to some of the salient human rights issues like pay and like GBVH and wages and stuff like that. But it allows us to be able to understand what the workers are facing in this factory and then develop programs to address those. So that's one of the ways that we incorporate the voice of the worker into some of our programmatics in the supply chain.
Thank you. That's really interesting. We are unfortunately at time. As always, there's so much more to discuss. This is a huge topic. We could probably go on talking about it all day. But I think we've sort of highlighted some pretty important issues. The first is there is no room for complacency here. We are nowhere near where we want to be in terms of achieving gender equality. The benchmark has highlighted it. I think all of the panelists today have reiterated it, and it's vital that we keep our eye on the prize here. Equally, things like the gender benchmark are vital to provide more information about what is happening, to fill in a data gap that remains a gaping hole in our understanding of where the apparel industry and other sectors are at, but will be so important in creating strategic solutions. This is also not an issue that any one stakeholder can address. Companies have a really important role to play. The private sector is vital, but so are all of the other stakeholders. Companies must listen to what the workers within their supply chains want in and of itself. That's the first step, but they also need to keep engaging with investors. Governments need to be involved to support with policy, and companies need to be very smart about how they're approaching this for a long term to create resilient corporations that are able to withstand the next crisis. I think this has given us a huge amount to think about and take away. Please do feel free to continue the conversation online. I want to thank the World Benchmarking Alliance for bringing us together for this really insightful conversation, and particularly Shamista and her team for this monumental piece of work. And of course, Ankita, Chris, Julie, Martha, and Paulina, thank you so much for your time and your insights. This has been amazing. And I look forward to hearing about the next steps from everyone.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.